Aloha and welcome to the 8th Annual Hawaii Energy Conference, presented by Maui Economic Development Board with support from the Maui County Office of Economic Development. Please welcome Conference Chair Doug McLeod and Vice Chair Frank Rego Jr. as they kick off Day 2.
Aloha kako e komo mai. Greetings and welcome to Day 2 of the Hawaii Energy Conference. We had a tremendous Day 1. So Doug, what do you think were the highlights of the first day?
You know, this feels like one of those inflection points where, you know, things are just coming together. There are these forces that seem to be pushing, you know, at the state level and the federal level, and there's just an astonishing level of activity that, you know, we're trying to capture in our conference this year. The image, I guess, that really sticks with me is, you know, seeing Teslas with the state of Hawaii badging on them. You know, if we had done a poll in this conference 5 years ago and asked, would the state of Hawaii be driving Teslas? I don't think most people would have said yes. So that to me, it's not so much that program is more important than the others we talked about, but it's symptomatic of these activities that are just coming together. And, you know, you know, what I mentioned there with the Tesla was at the end of the day, but, you know, we also started and talked through some of the federal things as well. So it's just been a period of extraordinary activity. You have the federal ESG, things coming from the SEC. We have things coming from our PUC that we'll be talking about in more detail, particularly the performance-based regulation that just started June 1. And then I also think that we gave a pretty good introduction of the kinds of siting issues that we're running into in Hawaii. And so if you're watching our program from somewhere else, you know, I think that your panel in particular, talking about investing respectfully, kind of showed some of the pitfalls that people have had. And I guess, how did you feel like that went? Did people get the right ideas?
Okay, well, personally, I was very impressed by the mana'o, the views expressed by our panel. For me, the lesson can be summed up in a Hawaiian saying, Nana kamaka, ho'oloe ka pepeau, pa'a kawaha, hana kalima. Observe with your hands, observe with your eyes, listen and comprehend with your ears, don't speak too quickly, and work with your hands. You could kind of summarize that in English is observe, listen and comprehend, reflect, and then create. That is the design process Hawaiian style. Those intending to develop projects in Hawaii should be doing a lot of observing, listening and comprehending, and reflecting with the community before they speak about their plans. It's a human-centered and values-centered process, not a project-driven one. So Doug, what do you think about what was covered on our performance-based regulation and those performance incentive mechanisms? I got the sense some organizations got a pass on that one, and I wasn't sure why.
Well, we're going right into some of the interesting parts. So yes, performance-based regulation started June 1, and we had a really nice detailed discussion with Commissioner Potter. And I think it did point out that there are some limits of really what we're including in PBR. One of them is that we're not including KIUC, the Kauai co-op. The other one is that we're not trying to take it down, you know, to all the individual island levels. And then, you know, the last maybe really obvious hole is that we're not including the gas company at all. So you get a sense that PBR is going to start by working with Hawaiian Electric because they've been so actively engaged. And of course, they're also the largest. But, you know, it feels like the choices were made here to try to see if we can make this work with Hawaiian Electric and then, you know, perhaps expand it. But I think you're right to call out that the choices were maybe, you know, based on ease of getting a program up and working, not so much based on logically what, you know, the approach of PBR is supposed to be, you know, incentives and carrots. And that if it works, it should logically work for the gas side as well as electric. But we're starting with the electric, and again, in fairness, Hawaii is being a pioneer here. So this isn't a criticism that we are trying it, we are leading, and it makes sense. And I would also say that if you follow the history here in Hawaii, you remember decoupling, which is kind of what we started with, let's call it 10 years ago. And decoupling was the idea of decoupling the revenues and the profits of the utility. And PBR is kind of a child of decoupling, you might say. It's sort of a progression from that. It's a separation, but decoupling was kind of a crude thing. And if you think about how the pandemic played out, it really doesn't make sense to have simply be a situation where the company's revenues are going to stay guaranteed, but the actual demand for their product drops due to a pandemic. So I would just say that the pandemic highlighted the shortcomings of decoupling, and PBR is a fresh start, and it does make a lot of sense. The PIMs themselves, these incentive mechanisms, it's really going to be something where I don't think we will know till 5 years from now if we really were measuring all the right things. The one that's interesting, for example, interconnection. So on the one hand, it makes a ton of sense to say that the utility has some control over interconnection. They have a lot of experience, and this has been a trigger point, with the solar industry for years. That's the problem. You got it. So I mean, if you're waiting for a building permit, that tends to be what's holding things up. So it wasn't always this way. 5-10 years ago, I think the utility was often, utility approvals on interconnection were taking just as long as the permitting. But where we are today, a lot of these delays are in areas outside of what the PUC can control. And so again, the PUC is providing an incentive and saying, you do your part, utility. But the utility is not able to actually give its customer what the customer wants, which is actual approval to turn on and install your system. So I would just say that, on that one, it's a really interesting concept. It makes a lot of sense, and we just probably won't know for a few years. I thought, the idea of trying to have a Z factor that's going to pick up what we don't really know. It's a really interesting idea. I'm just not sure that it's going to work. So I don't know.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the highlights of day one, but it might be more interesting for our viewers to talk about what wasn't talked about. So you got some ideas on that? What about electrification versus gas?
We're clearly going to jump right into some of these tough ones. So this morning,
we got 2 minutes, so we got about a minute for that one.
We're not an electricity conference. We're an energy conference. But the fact is that we've been covering, at least on day one, mainly things related to electricity because there's been so much progress there, so much going on. And these programs that we talked about with batteries and everything else. But if you say, does this make sense? Again, I think in Hawaii, we've had a PUC that's tremendously talented, and we've gotten kind of over-reliant in a sense because there's a lot of things that are simply outside their jurisdiction. So we can talk about being carbon-free, but if we have people importing propane and we have people bringing in other fossil fuels that aren't in a pipeline, they're not being regulated by the PUC. So I would just say that, really big picture, there are either some loopholes or some things missing from what we're trying to cover. And again, the gas company kind of hasn't been at the table, and part of that is because they've been for sale. So, that's certainly one of the reasons. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that sort of closes our highlights. Now I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing our invited speaker. Mark Toney, Executive Director of the Utility Reform Network, or TURN, in California, is no stranger to Hawaii or the Hawaii Energy Conference. In 2015, he was our invited speaker at our second annual conference. The topic then was climate affordability, getting to green and keeping the lights on. I'm loving its titles, Doug. California is always on the forefront of these along with issues, along with Hawaii, and we find their experience invaluable. Today, Mark will address Stop Overpaying for Solar and Other Pathways to Affordable Bills. As Mark is speaking, please submit your questions using the Questions tab to the right of the screen. Don't do it in chat. I won't see it. Okay, Mark, it's all yours.
Aloha kakau. It is my honor to open the second day of the Hawaii Energy Conference. I want to give my thanks to Frank Rego, Doug McLeod, and the entire Maui Economic Development Board. I would also like to acknowledge that I am calling in today from the ancestral lands and unceded territory of the sovereign Chochenyo Ohlone people who continue to live and thrive in territory currently known as Oakland, California. I'd like to give a few words of introduction here. I like to describe myself as an organizer by trade, a sociologist by discipline, and a troublemaker at heart. For the last 13 years, I've served as executive director at Turn, which was founded in 1973. We have a staff of 12 attorneys and 3 analysts who participate in over 100 California Public Utility Commission proceedings annually. We have a lobbying team in Sacramento to impact legislation. We have an organizing team to bring voices of communities of color into policy design and decision-making. We also have a communications team to drive the public debate on key policy initiatives. Turn believes that we can and should live in a society where electricity, broadband, and phone services are treated as basic rights for all families. So I'm here today to talk about how climate change policy needs to be centered on climate equity. The cost of greening the grid should not be cutting off Black, Brown, Indigenous, or any low-income communities from the grid because the prices are just too damn high. In 2019, California utilities cut off power to over 800,000 families. We're talking about 2.5 million children and adults cut off from power just because they fell behind in paying their bills. We can't afford to let electricity prices rise so high that it undermines fuel switching to electric vehicles from gasoline vehicles, to building electrification from natural gas. Now, I want to give a shout out to a report recently released by Severin Borenstein, Meredith Fowley, and James Sally of the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley. It's called Designing Electricity Rates for an Equitable Energy Transition. It does an excellent job explaining why rates in California are so high, artificially high, what can be done to fix it, and how if we don't bring down the prices, we're going to have a crisis on our hands. So in order to reach climate equity, we have to have a paradigm shift. We've got to stop depending on ratepayer subsidies as the primary driver for climate policy, and we need to move from subsidies to the regulatory requirements. We've got to figure out a way to move residential energy efficiency from being dependent on ratepayer subsidies to being dependent on building and appliance standards. When it comes to electric vehicle charging stations, we need to replace ratepayer subsidies with revenue from the transportation sector. When it comes to building electrification, we need to replace ratepayer subsidies with a requirement that new buildings are all electric and that existing buildings get transformed to electric as a requirement to close escrow. So what I'm going to talk about today is the largest driver of increasing climate inequity, the largest driver. And what that is right now in California, overpaying for rooftop solar. That's the largest driver of climate inequity. Non-solar customers are overpaying for rooftop solar. That's one piece. Two, rooftop solar customers pay too little for the energy grid. Three, low-income communities of color are systematically excluded from rooftop solar. And then four, I'm going to talk about NEM, the net energy metering modernization that will reduce the cost of solar and expand climate equity. So I'm going to start with non-solar customers pay too much for rooftop solar. In California, non-solar customers pay 3 cents per kilowatt hour for solar from large-scale projects. But we pay 26 cents, around 26 cents per kilowatt hour for rooftop solar, okay? You gotta understand from a consumer advocate standpoint, trying to control costs, we kind of like the 3% a little bit more than the 26 cents. It's all solar. This adds up to a $2.9 billion overpayment for rooftop solar in 2021 alone. And that's projected to increase to an overpayment of $6.6 billion by 2030, okay? And this is according to the Public Advocate's Office in California and their research. In 2021 alone, each non-solar customer will overpay on their bills an additional $100 to $230 annually, and this is going to rise every year. So rooftop solar customers pay too little for the energy grid. I want to challenge the myth that if a solar customer produces more electricity than they consume during a year, that they shouldn't have to pay anything for electricity. Having a solar rooftop system is not the same as being off the grid. The fact is that rooftop solar customers use the grid every single day. They sell excess electricity when the sun is shining. They need the grid for that. They buy electricity when the sun goes down from the grid. Every single day, the sun goes down. So in fact, solar customers are using the grid every day, and the problem is they are not paying their fair share of costs for public purpose programs like care low-income discounts, the operation of the grid, or wildfire mitigation. Now, let me talk about how low-income communities of color are systematically excluded from rooftop solar. So if you just look at how many people are participating, households receiving care discounts represent 28% of PG&E residential customers, but only 1.7% of the rooftop solar customers at PG&E. If you take Southern California Edison, same pattern. 32% of all customers are care customers, but they only represent 1.5% of Edison rooftop solar customers, just a tiny percentage. Now, of course, we know that renters can't install solar, landlords have no reason to lower renter bills. We know that low-income homeowners lack access to capital. But here's the other insidious rate design issue. Because solar subsidies are based on retail rates paid by customers, care customers receive less subsidies than non-care customers, than more wealthy customers. So it takes low-income customers a longer time to pay back the investment on their systems than it does wealthy customers. And remember, care customers have to pay the same for the solar system. They don't get a discount just because they're care customers when they are buying and installing a solar system. So this is a huge inequity in the current California Net Energy Metering NEM program. Now, modernizing NEM will reduce the cost of solar and expand climate equity. Let me tell you how. One, future rooftop solar customers will be fairly compensated for the value that their solar system actually contributes to the grid. The California Commission has an avoided cost formula that actually determines the hourly value of the credit based upon location, avoided distribution and transmission costs, avoided methane leakage, a whole host of things. So instead of tying the compensation to an artificial, arbitrary number, we're going to tie it to the actual value. Any additional subsidies for future rooftop solar customers should come from non-ratepayer funding, such as general tax revenue, cap and trade, or other sources. So let's talk now about the current rooftop solar customers. We believe they should be allowed to remain on their existing rates for now, but that they ought to make a small contribution to subsidizing rooftop solar for low-income customers who've been left behind. And we're talking about $20 a month, okay, to support climate equity, to help the low-income customers, and to provide upfront rebates to low-income customers with new solar systems that'll help them achieve a 10-year payback period. Climate equity means that all communities get to share clean energy benefits. Currently, rooftop solar customers benefit from generous subsidies, which significantly favor higher income homeowners and disproportionately leave low income and neighbors of color behind. Smarter, more equitable solar incentives will provide a faster transition to clean energy, lower the cost of monthly electricity bills, and create a more fair and balanced system. Prioritizing the larger scale renewable systems, which can support entire communities instead of a single home, can make renewable power a reality for low-income families and help us achieve our goals, climate goals, more quickly. Overpaying for solar undermines state climate goals by making electricity bills too costly for California residents to switch to electric vehicles, electric water heaters, electric stoves, electric heating systems. This is what we want to encourage California residents to do. Right now, rooftop solar is far less expensive than ever to purchase and install. And yet, rooftop solar subsidies continue to rise. Unless the CPUC modernizes this outdated system, non-solar users will be increasingly overcharged, utility bills will skyrocket for non-solar customers, and California's transition to a clean, renewable, zero-carbon electric system will be undermined by electricity prices that are artificially too high.
There is one question here that we have in our question queue. What about electrification by hydrogen? Is there a way of, I guess this is a question about the energy mix. There's a lot of emphasis on solar, which is, capital intensive. Maybe having more of an energy mix in terms of hydrogen might help climate equity. You got any thoughts on that?
Green hydrogen has tremendous potential because you can store it okay, in a way similar to how natural gas is stored. The challenge is, how is the hydrogen gas produced? A lot of hydrogen gas is produced using fossil fuels. I got to tell you, that is not clean. What we need to do is to define clean hydrogen fuel as that which is produced during the midday hours when we have an overproduction of solar from the rooftop systems that will then allow us to divert that excess solar and put it into hydrogen production. That would be the smartest way to incorporate clean green hydrogen as part of the solution.
Thank you for that. I'm going to bring in Doug McLeod on this now. He has a couple of questions for you.
Hey, Mark, I just wanted to say first, there are a lot of people in the room that are going to have sore necks later. You know, we were all nodding along to your comments. But here in Hawaii, I've heard it said that NEM is the gift that keeps on giving because the program's closed to new entrants. But if you sell a home, it's grandfathered in the sense that the new purchaser gets these same benefits. Does that occur in Hawaii? And do you have any thoughts on the fairness? Sorry, does that occur in California as well? And do you have any thoughts on the fairness of that?
Well, that's one of the issues that is going to be that we expect to be addressed either in this particular proceeding or in another proceeding. Right now, I am not exactly sure of how the property transfer works. Part of it may be different based upon whether the person owns the property, owns the panels outright, or whether they're leasing them. So I'm not exactly sure, Doug.
We also have had a distinction here in Hawaii between Kauai, where they use what they call Schedule Q. It's a variable avoided cost model versus Hawaiian Electric that's been using a fixed model. Is one of your ideas that people should be moving towards more of a variable cost, in terms of what the benefit is to the grid?
I'm glad you asked that, Doug. That is exactly what the California Commission's avoided cost model does. It's calculated on an hourly basis, and it takes into account things like location, because location makes a difference. The avoided cost of transmission and distribution, because rooftop solar does bring these values, okay, and we want to recognize them. When we're complaining about the 26 cents versus the 3 cents for the larger, we're not saying that rooftop solar should only get 3 cents. We recognize that rooftop solar brings more value, but not quite as high. It should be based on the actual realities. And you're right, that is variable on an hourly basis, but also depending on location and other factors.
Okay. Well, we'd like to thank Mark Toney of Turn for his insights. Thanks, Mark. It's always great to have you. You're very passionate, and you always have something informative for our attendees to go home and think about. So we'd like to ask everyone, mahalo and a hui hou.
Mahalo.